Welcome to this New Year's reading. I'm very excited for this. We have three amazing poets. Could have been a celebration of any of them. Carlie Hoffman is the author of When There Was Light and This Alaska, winner of the NCPA Gold Award in Poetry and finalist for the Forward Indies Book of the Year Award. She is the translator from the German of White Shadows. Carlie's honors include the 92nd Street Y Discovery Boston Review Poetry Prize, a Poets and Writers Amy Award, the Loose Translation Award, and fellowships from Columbia University and the City University of New York. Her work has been published in Los Angeles Review of Books, the Kenyon Review, Poetry Daily, Boston Review, New England Review, Jewish Currents, and other publications. Carlie lives in Brooklyn, where she edits Small Orange Journal and is a lecturer of creative writing at SUNY Purchase. Hi.
Hi, Nick, thank you for that. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, good. There's the spotlight. I just wanted to congratulate Cindy for her latest book, Back to the Woods, which is stunning. Hope everybody buys a copy and reads it. I tell Cynthia this often. It's always true that we are very lucky to live in the time of Cynthia Cruz writing and publishing poetry. So I was going to just read 3 poems from my first book and then 3 poems from my recent book. Okay. Thanks for listening. Learning to be still. All afternoon, it rains on the traffic outside my window. It's nothing new, but I can't get the thought of pigeons, strange magistrates of sickness and beauty carved away from me, or how it's been 2 years since I've stood in a line of waitresses at the hot food window of a restaurant in Hackensack, New Jersey. The row of us identical in black slacks and kitchen shoes, like pigeons stacked along a telephone wire, waiting to serve fish and curry rice to strangers. I was so young before New York that I believed loving myself each day would be easier there. But lying in bed, I can hear the wind and the trees shaking because they have no choice. And I want to go someplace where the trees grow apples, shiny and persistent as stars. Of course it hurts, knowing how wrong this is. This constant need for movement, even backwards, like my desire, just now, to enter the bathroom of some North Jersey diner after licking the gravy bowl clean, after so much hunger, and return to the dinner rush, wearing an apron again, coffee pot in hand, to walk in circles until there becomes no here or now to speak of. Goat. For 6 years, we slept in a porcelain tub. The door bolted. Mother smoking quietly at the window. Faucet run high to bleach my father's return from the night. The 7th year, the year he came home in late afternoon, carrying a severed goat's head. He was done, he said, finished, with the milk and pills of other women, and nailed it to the wall in the living room. Winter. When my sisters can't scrub the oil from the sick gull's feathers, they clip its wings, untie the cord that binds the slow sheet of its body, and plant it into a wooden box drilled with tiny holes. It is my turn to bring the diseased bird to the breeder across the bank. His medicine knives, his hut occupied with feeders and soap. But because I am youngest, because a hunter's moon is how I locate heaven, I take the gull down the wharf, kneel in an untouched tract of snow, and quiet its skull with rock. While waitressing at the kosher restaurant, a man calls me a whore, and a woman rushes behind me into the kitchen to hand me her baby. Every season is good for killing girls. The seaweed black night, foaming with stars. A plaque of women's names. Before Mary's a whore, a baby is placed in the frozen bird of her lap. The dignity in being. Every place that hurts you is the season where the sun bursts like salmon on fire. Think of Eve, shivering naked beneath the altar, watching God get angry. Is it anger or is it grief? All of us doing what we've been trained to do. In the Jewish religion, a Yahrzeit is the year anniversary of someone's death. This poem is called Yahrzeit in December. She is paranoid like my mother and me. When she answers my call and responds, "What do you really want?" in tiny bursts, in between pauses. And I could stand relieved all afternoon in Brooklyn, in front of the butcher shop, tracing back the gene of neuroticism that gorges on a mind. And for the first time I love how a blizzard comes down in fractions. I'm completely sure that December is the month of remembering the dead, because today is the anniversary of her brother's heart, eaten by the snow, which I don't speak of, because I can only say I am her brother's granddaughter, and though we have never met, I need to know about the ship that carried my bone math, the hind legs of a lamb swaying in the butcher's window that reflects my face, countering my face. And the last poem I'll read is a dedication to my grandfather, which the book is in conversation with. He was a Holocaust survivor. And much of the book, When There Was Light, is about my family's immigration story from Germany to New York. And he was a farmer. After the farm was sold to FedEx, my grandfather is still alive, living upstate, smoking on the porch with one leg up. He's watching a cloud of boys toss a baseball back and forth with such grace and economy, sneakers kicking dust into apricot mouths, sweating backs colorful and clawed. He is watching them move toward their most primitive selves, flaming horses in the old barbed wire farm. So much of what's been lost belongs to the ground. Newspaper headlines, the family name, all drunk and dreamed away. Soon, every voice around wills the present tense. Like their country's flag, all the mothers wave dish towels out the kitchen windows for their sons to come inside and wash their hands. Wait, he says, and the wind catches. The boys drop their mitts offhandedly on the grass. Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Allison, and I'm going to read your bio. Allison Benis White is the author of The Wendy's, Please Bury Me in This, winner of the Rilke Prize, and Small Porcelain Head, selected by Claudia Rankine for the Four-Way Books Leavis Prize in Poetry, and named a finalist for the Penn Center USA Literary Award and California Book Award. Her first book, Self-Portrait with Crayon, received the Cleveland State University Poetry Center Book Prize. Her poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, New England Review, Plowshares, Pushcart Prize, 41, Best of the Small Presses, and elsewhere. She is an associate professor at the University of California, Riverside. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. You can hear me? Yes. Thank you. So glad to be here. That was an amazing reading, Carlie. I love your work, and I love Cindy's work. And congratulations, Cindy. Brilliant. I've been a fan of Cindy Cruz's work for since I read her first book, Rune, and it hurt me so exquisitely and revealed myself to me in a way that I hadn't previously experienced. And feel like, and then I reached out to Cindy directly, and then I sent her my first book in hopes that our books were in conversation with each other, and they were indeed. So I'm just so grateful to be here to celebrate her new book. And I was thinking, to me, there's that famous epistolary quote from Kafka about why we read, sort of his reading philosophy. And I'm sure some of you have heard this before, but this is what Cindy's books are to me. Kafka writes, "I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound or stab us. If the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for?" And then I'll skip ahead, and he says, "We need books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. That is my belief." And that is my belief about Cynthia Cruz's work. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a favorite poem of mine of Cynthia's, and then I'll read a couple poems of my own. But this is a poem that was originally published in the New Yorker, called Diagnosis, and it gestures, or more than gestures, toward anorexia in a way that I've never seen duplicated in another poem. But even more than that, it just captures what it's like to be a mind inside a particular body at a particular time. And I just love this poem. Also, I really love the internal rhymes, and there's always like a sliver of Plath there for me. So again, this is called Diagnosis by Cynthia Cruz. Awkward and almost always the idiot, savant, mutant, retard, I travel my own effervescent weather in my underwater vessel, my sweet Mars and soundless daydream, magical sweep of Rambodian reverie. Always clumsy and guileless, mind blind and deathly shy, winning every spelling bee, every math contest, done before the rest, finishing first in a science test, hiding the quarterly honor roll awards I won beneath the bed. The shame of being seen consumes me, and I fight it back, a landowner warding off leagues of feral thieves, with fire handheld torch burning back the onslaught. In grade school, listening to the same Blondie song in my bedroom over and over for hours, days, for years, no friends, but the one, silent and sitting in my head, running laps around the house for 5, 10, 15 miles, counting calories of everything put into my mouth, desperate to ward the onslaught off until I am nothing but a body, burn the body down, and with it out goes the pilot blue light of the mind. Everyone said I was pretty back then. Maybe way back then, before I began. I mean, really, it's the kind of poem for me that it's like, I don't need to write anymore. Thank you, Cindy. You said it. But I will read a couple of my own poems since that is what I've been asked to do, and I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to read two poems of my own. One is, they're both elegiac. I feel like all the work I'm doing is elegiac, always. It's just the thing that overwhelms me and brings me to the page to seek language, just to articulate it. And to discover something as well. So these poems, I'm going to read, are called Postcards to M, and they're 7 4-line poems. And they were inspired initially by Isaru Sasaki's Phone of Wind, which is a glass phone booth he built on the edge of a mountain overlooking water in order to contact dead loved ones. And it became this like exhibit open to the public. It's really quite cool. And there's several M's that I'm writing to, but the one that I've dedicated this poem to is Molly Brodak, who took her life in 2020. And I was interested in writing these poems. I was just really interested in what could happen in 4 lines. And so this is what happened in 4 lines, 7 times. Postcards to M. That you have grown still enough to write to, or to be left alone, to be left alone. A few hours from here, a field of poppies so red, I want to be cut, stain the seams, tear myself apart. That place so close to the end of a song, in the pause, just afterward, the silence rushing in. Here is my mind, tilted into my hands. What kind of loneliness is this, kissing every finger? To your lost room, all pictures of wildflowers. To your lost room, honey poured on your tongue by someone you love. Silence thick as frosting in my mouth. Then the music of your name. A place to tell you something, to tell myself. I tried to call you in the dream, but I could not dial correctly. I could not die correctly. In a dark gold dress, the madness has gone quiet. A memory of your face as radiant anxiety. Opening a series of boxes, and inside the last, smallest one, a pearl. What things did you imagine to cool your mind? Even if it is to die, it is beautiful to decide. In the window near my desk, my face trapped in light. A cutout woman in a cutout dress, cutting out her paper death. What is it? What is there to feel now that would matter? Here, wish you were. I should say, this little series of poems is forthcoming in my next book, out from 4-Way Book, the best 4-Way books in 2025. It's called A Magnificent Loneliness. And I'll read one more poem that is also in that forthcoming book. It's another sort of elegiac piece. It's called Description of Symptoms, and I wrote it after a doctor's appointment. I was having all these symptoms and I couldn't quite understand what was going on. And I was also grieving a friend who had taken her life, which just for whatever reason has been a part of my life repeatedly. And so I sort of tend to, like I said, focus on the page in response to these overwhelming experiences of loss. So this is description of symptoms. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 5 stanzas, but each stanza is on a separate page. For whatever that's worth. We are visual creatures, and it matters to know that. And this poem surprised me with its ending, which I think is the great hope for me, like as a writer, is to be surprised, to discover something. So here we go, description of symptoms. Now my hands buried in my hair, resting on piano keys in the back of my head. This is the music I am playing through my mind. A dark room singing a song that will not have children. Lying on the floor tonight, snowflakes cut from paper laid over my eyes. A hand carved from wood laid over my mouth. If the truth is the thing you must not say, I will speak for the vase now as it falls. It is better never to be at all. A hand on the back of my head made of glass, my love, my eyes filled with wire, life. Once I watched a bird's shadow cross a field in the wind, a black hat that could not stop tumbling. My eyes are sore from seeing, my lips from speaking. How a ribbon curls when pulled across a scissors blade. I am practicing transformation, pain. How the dark hair of imagination, uncut, grows down to the floor. What is left but to make a world, a war, or a landscape in which to stay alive? Ghost flower, house of breath. Another wish, language drilled through ice, through my life. If grief is love with nowhere to go, this is my turning is somewhere.
I think we had a freeze up. Oh, the joys of Zoom. Well, beautiful reading. Elegiac always. The future Allison Benis White autobiography. And now, to borrow a Carlie Hoffman title, The GOAT, the greatest of all time, Cynthia Cruz. Cynthia Cruz is the author of 8 collections of poems, including Back to the Woods, her newest, Hotel Oblivion, Guidebooks for the Dead, Dregs, and How the End Begins, among many more, as well as the new novel, Steady Diet of Nothing. She is the recipient of fellowships from Yaddo, McDowell, and the Hodder Fellowship from the Princeton University. Her collection, Hotel Oblivion, was the finalist for the Kingsley Tufte Awards and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. She is currently pursuing a PhD at the European Graduate School, where her research focuses on Hegel and madness. Disquieting, Essays on Silence, a collection of critical essays exploring the concept of silence, was published in the spring of 2019. And The Melancholia of Class, an exploration of melancholia and the working class, was published in 2021.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, right, for letting us celebrate in this way. And thank you so much, Carlie and Allison. Your work is so amazing. And also for Way for publishing us. We're all sisters, which is really beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to read a poem that's not mine, and then I'm going to read some new poems I've written in the past couple of years, and then one I've written in the last couple of years, and then a few that I've written in the last year. And then I'm going to end with a few from the book that we're celebrating. So I hope that's okay with everyone. You can, if you're not okay with that, if you don't like what I'm doing, you can mark it in the chat book, chat thing, and I'll look later. Okay, so I'm going to start with a poem that's not mine. It's a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, translated by Fadi Judah, and it's To Our Land. To Our Land. And it is the one near the word of God, a ceiling of clouds. To our land. And it is the one far from the adjectives of nouns, the map of absence. To our land. And it is the one tiny as a sesame seed, a heavenly horizon, a hidden chasm. To our land. And it is the one poor as a grouse's wings, holy books, and an identity wound. To our land, and it is the one surrounded with torn hills, the ambush of a new past. To our land, and it is a prize of war, the freedom to die from longing and burning in our land. And its bloodied night is a jewel that glimmers for the far upon the far and illuminates what's outside it. As for us inside, we suffocate more. And the next poem, so I know some of my wonderful and beautiful students are here, and I often have them do after poems. These poems, so you find a poem that you really love, a poem that you have memorized, and you just do an after, like the Dennis Johnson, Lucy Brockboy, a lot of these poets do poems in honor of other poems that they love, and it can create this kind of tree of poems, which is really beautiful. And for a lot of the students I've worked with, I've had them do John Weiner's Charity Balls poem. And so I did one, and this is Charity Balls after John Weiner's. It's a great poem. His is a great poem. I had an accident, but lived in elegance. On methamphetamines and small stacks of Black Beauty paperbacks, and plastic plates of bread and black cherry marmalade. Later, a career of killing time and wasting money. But I've always been extraordinarily gifted at being alone. At the age of 5, I thought I would never speak. And it wasn't until I was 13 that I knew it was true. In blonde wig, old worn denim, and gold chain with plastic pink Saint Genet pendant, I entered the terminal infirmary of music and moved the body as though engaged in infinite reenactments of the sacred, murmuring among my people in the ruins of the institutions of this city, awaiting dispersal of food stamps and low-cost medicine. But I always knew if I worked hard enough, I would never make it. And then the next few are really new. They're actually, I think they're all from the summer. Poem 1. Black ponies, glass windows, yellowing hillsides. Detective novels, creamy white face paint. Hiding inside the world, outside the world. I slept with my black bear and never spoke, only in gestures, my hand drawing a small world on bits of scrap paper. Wild foxes, their bodies submerged in mange, desire, and deathly illness, creeping through the blinding wet gauze of daylight. When I stroke the animal's warm white neck, it purrs like an animal. I perform death, its final 3 stages, and I trace the language of its incision, listening for its god-like ring. And this poem is called Fragment. Fragment. The star in the animal's heart makes the animal cry. It is the loneliness of the annihilation of all the others who have gone before it. It knows its end is coming, and with it, the vanishing of the world. It sleeps beneath the tree as the world's shadow begins. And this is a longer poem. It's called Horse Striking Its Hoof on the Ground. Now, a glittering black child's horse swimming. When it stops, I stop, breathing. I am still waiting for the right words to begin speaking. Or is this what it means to be human? I drank until I fell into a shallow, dreamless sleep. The soldiers were not unkind. Their bodies, mere bodies, hid inside the shadow of history. History itself hid inside its own shadow. This moment is neither now nor in the future. Repetition is not repetition. Repetition is not mere repetition. It smuggles within it a substance, the end of all things, but also the beginning of something entirely without precedent. And this is called Fragment Dora, and it's for Freud's Dora. The lion, Freud says, springs only once. Little haunts his fear of horses, an endless golden ribbon at the edge of everything. In dreams, the white horse, its large, white, beautiful body, drops down to the concrete ground. There is always something unpaid, something extra, a remnant, excrement. A long knife beneath the enormous white cake, slowly removing one slice. In ecstasy, Dora on the soft black leather sofa, dreaming of the coming of the new world. And then now I'm going to read a few poems from the new book, the book that we're celebrating. But I first have to read the opening citation by Frank Stanford, which is great. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed, it says in the Bible somewhere. And I should say the new book, Back to the Woods, right? It's inspired or ghosted. That's the wrong word. There's the haunted, sorry, not ghosted, because they actually show up by Frank Stanford and Mark Linkous. So Frank Stanford is throughout the book. This poem is called Father. Zechariah is the name for sugar. Can you tell him that? He said, walking out of the dream. In Bible study, he said, Cindy, you are saved. He poured milk into the tea and gave me a belt to ward off the darkness. I would ride out with him into the country in his old station wagon, and he'd point out the places where God had been. Tiny, near invisible X's, he said, counting under his breath. He had been to the war and ran for miles every night to race the violence out of his body. In the end, it's just a small mark, the place where the outside tears in, stamps its human hand on the spirit. And this poem is called Alchemy. When I was a child, Father would take me with him on the road. We'd sit along the crimson leather seats of the booths in the quiet diners of highway truck stops, eating nothing, drinking waters and root beer. His face was not his face. It was the face of his father and his father's father. Years of hard labor pressed like a miracle into the shimmering oracle of his dark continents, warped and damaged like a map held underwater for centuries. We never spoke. He was like a god to me, the way he kept himself inside himself, as if his spirit belonged to him. And this is the last poem I'm going to read from the book. It's called The Overburden. Through the gelatinous and rotting gardens of morning, and indecipherable the nothingness of milk and flowers, When they found you in that hotel room, you were still dreaming. The window, a star smeared with sorrow, like a jar of warm white whiskey. Outside the abandoned bodies of cars and silver engines, a charger in the yard, glimmering in the sun like a tooth held underwater. The sound of your voice, a girl's in a field recording, trapped on cheap plastic microphone, set to the tune of a far-off waltz. A violin and voices recorded from bars and locked stalls of filling station bathrooms. Leaning against a wall of the ruins, struggling to wake from the stupor of the obscene dream that is America. And that's it.
The obscene dream. So for this part, I don't feel particularly eloquent this morning. How should we do this? Start with ghosted versus haunted, perhaps?
I have a question. I want to know about, Cindy, what your recent writing process has been like for this new book.
Thank you for the question. You know, I turned off that weird light that I had and now I'm like super ghost. Was it better with like the halo or is it better with the ghost? You know, it looked like I don't watch those shows, but like the late night shows where the lady goes down to the you know? No, you don't. It's like no.
This is
Okay.
very horror movie lighting. I love it.
Doesn't it look like I looks like I'm a ghost?
You look,
But-
I think you look fantastic. You look very, very alive and well.
Yeah, so the poems, I'll just say the poems that I read, I wrote trying to think exactly. I wrote them at this table, but I think in the morning. I don't know, that's not really what you asked, but I'm doing so much. So it's a little bit like when I did Hotel Oblivion where I was doing research during the day. And so I would get up every morning at 6 and I would have an hour to write the poems and I wrote a poem every day and they spoke to each other. It's not quite like that because I don't write every morning. But what happens is all of the work that I'm working on makes its way into the poems without me trying, if that makes any sense. I mean, I know you all know what I'm talking about.
So
But
this is
one is that,
to
oh,
balance.
sorry.
This is your answer to balancing writing novels, writing poetry, and working on a PhD is like everything is everything.
Yeah, that's what I always say. It's all the same. So there's no, it's not like there's you know, Hegel and madness, and then there's you know, whatever private stuff, and then poems, it's all nothing's off limits. That's my main lesson that I'm teaching everyone.
Right, we want to know about your novel too, please, in the chat. People are demanding.
No, there's nothing to say about it. You just have to read it.
Very savvy.
Mm,
Is it too early for poetry? Is that part of it?
yeah,
Here in California, it's 9:47.
I know it's very early for you.
Yes, I just had to let everybody know that. For me.
I mean, I could just sit here and admire Cynthia and Allison.
Same.
Oh, Hadara has a question. What makes poetry a resident container for elegy? That's a beautiful question. Hi, Hadara.
Hi, you know, it seems like it's something that crossed all three of your readings. And, you know, and I say this also as a poet who's sort of obsessed with death and loss also. Like, even if I try to write about like a door, I end up back at death anyway. And so it's just something that I've kind of surrendered to, but am interested in how other writers approach this. Like, why what about poetry makes it the right container or a resonant container for death, for loss, elegy? And thank you also for a beautiful reading. I'm so heartened in the middle of a Saturday and glad to be with you all here. Thank you.
Thanks, Adara. What do you think, Carlie?
I'm thinking about the question.
Too.
Yeah, I think grief appears. Well, I think my first book is an elegy in many ways, and so was my second book. But I don't know. And my first book, I inhabited an imaginative space to think about death, to think about my relationship with life and death through just the mind and the figure in poetry, which was helpful. It was really useful to do that. I'm thinking of Italo Calvino, the Invisible Places. Can't remember. Invisible Cities. Thanks, Allison. And now in this next book, it's more direct, I think, more specific and grounded in place. But I still do that. I still go to like an imaginative space in the mind, try to embody that through language. Because actually, Allison, something you said about the surprise, like the end of your poem surprised you. I wish to always be surprised. And I think like strangeness is what surprises me in poetry. Yeah.
Ironically, I think it was been communicated to me that I said, "Oh, the end of this poem surprised me," and then I froze or something before I read the end of the poem. So you're gonna have to get A Magnificent Loneliness and find out what happens to be surprised yourself. Or I could just tell you. I think also grief is like I was just reading some quote that poetry is one of the key art forms that kind of pierces the subterranean level of what it is to be human and all those feelings that kind of that can't get named. And I think that death is like or responding to death, grieving, it's like it's such a space of bewilderment, and there's so little language that seems satisfying that somehow poetry always, or still so far, gives me a space to exist in bewilderment. And it's also, I think poetry is a space that where things can be unresolved. And also I think that for me anyway, grief doesn't, there is a story of grief, but grief isn't telling a linear story. And poetry also seems to be a great genre to abandon linearity. And partially because it's brief, because it's so painful to abandon linearity for too long, at least for me, though I want to desperately. And so poetry kind of is in its brevity, is a space, I think, to, and also to be unresolved. It can't be too unresolved for too long, and that becomes too much. So I feel like the intensity and the brevity sort of allow that for me anyway.
I was thinking, I agree. I think, I mean, I wanted to say, I noticed that all of our poems were elegiac also, and I thought that was interesting. And I guess the thing that I would say is that I think that for me, poetry is the one, I mean, there's also visual art and music and dance, obviously, but it's able to put words to what otherwise could not be put into words, right? And so, right, my essays are different than my poetry or fiction because poetry is trying to put into words and that's what I think grief, right? This trauma or grief, actually, there's no actual language for it, but poetry can kind of mimic it in a way. And then I guess I feel bad. I just saw in the chat that people actually did ask about the book. So I will say that I wrote Steady Diet of Nothing. I wrote a draft of it 20 years ago, actually. It's a very old book. And I brought it to a workshop and was told that it was I got the big thumbs down. They said it was really not good at all. And so I put it away and didn't go back to it until recently. So it's an old book, but it's revised. So it's an old book and then it was revised. So it's now. And I guess what I would say, I can't really say what it's about, but it's I guess I would say it's my poems in novel form. It's similar, but it's different to that. Well, should we ask each other questions, or
Yeah.
do people want to ask us questions? I can't tell if people are asking us questions.
Well, I want to know, because I don't see any questions in the chat. I want to know, Carlie, what you're working on. What's happening in your life?
Oh, thanks for the question, Allison. It's so nice to see you.
Yeah, so good to see you too.
Cynthia. I'm working on my third book. It's coming out with Four Way in 2025 also. I'm working on my fourth book, which is almost done. Sort of almost done. And I'm translating Rose Auslander, working on her Selected, and also working on another poet, Selma Mirbaum Eisinger, who was Paul Celan's younger cousin. I'm coming out with a new translation of her book that survived concentration camp. She did not survive, but her manuscript did. What about you, Allison or Cynthia?
I'm working on a little series, which is my favorite thing, of poems in response to a contemporary artist named Bob Ray. He has a show in South Carolina next year, and I was asked to write some poems sort of loosely ekphrastically, which I've never done before. I've never been commissioned to do anything but I looked at his work and it's fantastic. Look him up on Instagram, whatever. He's the curator, the person who asked me to do this, is a genius, because this man's work and is as this man Bob Ray, he said about my work, he said, she is saying what I am seeing. And I'm like, oh my God, that's how it feels. So it's kind of this little gift to be asked to intersect with this artist. And it's kind of the happiest I've ever been writing, because I'm not thinking about a book. I'm just thinking about writing these few poems for this like one specific audience. So it's really, really, it's a good time, which, like I said, I don't normally say about being a poet.
That's amazing. So, but the poems that you read, those are from the book that's coming out in 2025. So that's different, yeah?
That is different. Yes, those are.
What was the name of, I think it was an artist, maybe a Japanese artist who you said had the
Phone of Wind. Yeah, Ataru Sasaki. The last name is Sasaki, and yeah, it's like it's
amazing.
Look it up if anyone is not familiar with it. And it has a disconnected, obviously rotary phone, and people just can go in there and call whoever they want to and have a conversation. It's just and he did it initially for personal reasons. He had lost his cousin, and that was his way to mourn. And that's like the best way to mourn I've ever heard of. Mm-hmm.
It's totally amazing.
Yeah. It really is. And I do feel like that is what we're talking about, Hadara's question. It's like, I am just picking up that disconnected phone on the reg, trying to say something, to hold both sides of the conversation.
Both of you are so busy. It's amazing.
I
I know that you're also teaching so much, and then you're translating 2 books and writing. It's amazing.
Isn't it true though, as writers, that we always feel like other people are doing so much, but at least I never feel like I'm doing much. And yet it accumulates. I'm always like just amazed at both of you and other writers in general.
Yeah, I think I loved, Cynthia, what you said about like everything is everything, or everything is part of everything. Like I think that I remember when, I don't know, like, because I'm so glad that your novel is out, because I remember there was, I feel like I'd known about it for like a time, and it was really exciting to read it, but also thinking about how you, I imagine, I mean, this is an assumption, maybe I should ask you, do you like, were you taking you would go to the novel and maybe you'd work on that, but maybe would you write a poem or work on your research or like that kind of thing? Like, I'm just really curious about your interdisciplinary process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I wrote the first draft of that, I wrote it. I wasn't doing anything else. And then like I said, I threw it away. But I had some old copies. And then when I went back to it, I was working on it and the poems, do you know? And I think, I was gonna say so I'm mostly working these days on the dissertation, which is on Hegel, Marx and Madness, and but there's also Freud and Lacan, and that's, if you notice, I think at least one of the poems I read at the end is a horse. I had a horse.
Mhm.
And I've always had horses, right? I always had horses. But I noticed over the summer that I was writing all of these fantastical horse poems. And that's when I went back and noticed that Little Hans, Freud's non-case, he didn't actually work with Hans, but anyway, he had a obsession with horses. And so then I've decided to do this whole series. So I didn't know. It's so interesting the way that works. So I was writing all these horse poems, and then I thought, wait, didn't he have that thing with horses? And then I've written a bunch of poems. So the reason I say that is because it relates to the Freud stuff is related to the academic work, but then it bleeds right into it, right? And I hadn't noticed that the horse is falling. This is this thing he kept thinking was happening, that it was actually coming from there. And so that's why it's like so great, because it's totally different, but then they're related, right?
Yeah. I admire that about your work, Cynthia. I really do. Go ahead, Allison, maybe.
Oh, I was just going to say that the nothing or everything is, is intersecting. I say this to my students, but also I say this to myself regularly, is like nothing is wasted. Like everything I'm doing is useful, or it's that Frost quote about the education of the poet. He says a poet walks through the fields and sees what sticks to him. And I was like, yes, that sounds like exactly the education that I want. But I love the idea that nothing is wasted. And for me, that's like really attached to drafts that I can never get right. Anything and everything I'm reading and watching and experiencing, like that it's all useful, especially the failures. I tell myself. Hi, Jillian. Good to see you in the chat. Oh, there's a question. Is the dissertation in German? How do two languages nourish you? This is for Cindy, but also Carlie, perhaps.
It's not in German. That's a great question, though. But German is a really all right. So I'm not making any comments about Germany or the country or things like that. That's a different conversation. But the language is interesting because there's a lot of overdetermination, which I think is, Hegel works a lot with that. So in English, there will be one word and it matches one word, obviously. But in German, there will be one word, and then it Geist, Hegel's Geist is spirit, it's the mind, it's all this stuff. And so there's this kind of, the word nourish is great because the German language is very nourishing in that way, but it's also really great for writing. Carlie, I'm sure you know all about, right, with the translation, that means that you can use one word and it sort of winks at all these other words, what the English language doesn't do so much of.
So I see one more question in the chat that's directed at me from Timothy Brennan. Allison, you mentioned the space of poetry as a place where mourning or trauma can be formed into art. Can you speak more about that space? I feel like that space is I always think of it sort of as a actual room, but in the room, I'm just going in circles, that's the space, like physically speaking. And I think that my friend actually said this when our friend took her life. She said I opened a door to a room that I didn't know existed, and not that I can't get out of the room, but it exists like indefinitely now. And so I almost feel like, I don't know if the art is making that space, but that I'm making art inside that space. But I think I do think it is about when one is overwhelmed, or at least this is my experience, that's what brings me to the page. And so often grief, especially complex, trauma loss is something that overwhelms. And I've come to understand about myself that that is just the nature of what I need to do for my own mental, spiritual, physical health, and also it's hopefully a piece of art. But regardless, it's like somehow I need to go to the page in order to create some sort of movement. Like I said, even if the movement is just circular, there is movement, and that seems mandatory for my well-being. And I think reading poems in particular that are dealing with grief and loss, that also feels mandatory. It's the place I go for that relief and that communion and that electricity of articulation that I crave. Thank you for the question.
I was just thinking about what you said about movement, which is, I'll have to think about that more. I think it's really important, but also repetition, and how repetition is super interesting, right? Because it's what we do all the time. It's like compulsive repetition, but each time it brings about something incrementally new, which is so great. And then I was thinking about how I'll say for myself, but I know both of your work, and I would say it's also true with you also, that our work tends to be repetitive, but then each time we go back to the topic, for me at least, it's almost always the same topic, but it totally changes. It's exactly that thing. It like changes incrementally. So it's, I remember Marie Howe, who was a teacher of mine in grad school. She said, she was talking about how poets, she might have said most poets, which I don't think is true, but I think a lot of poets, there are certain poets who repeat over and over the same topic, right? But it changes every time. Not everybody does that, but I think it's really interesting.
That's really true of your work, Cynthia. I'm going to add that last year, I think it was last year, maybe it was 2 summers ago, I spent time with all of your books again, reading through them. It was when Hotel Oblivion came out. And what's really fascinating about your work is that so many of the objects or images, when they return, they really do return changed or transformed or deepened. There's an added perspective. And it's always your voice, though. It's always this mesmerizing, haunting Cynthia Cruz voice. But the images have been transfigured in some way, and so is the speaker. And I find that very inspiring. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very hopeful. It's maybe you meant inspiring in terms of anyway, but I think it's really hopeful, because it means that that we do change, that even though it's the same thing over and over, it still means that it means that we're changing, which is, it's great. It's good news.
I always just think I don't want to come to the same conclusions. If I can come to a slightly different conclusion, like you said, the incremental change, Cindy, like that's what I'm after as well. Or I think about Shawshank Redemption, where he's digging his way out of the prison, with a spoon, and all he can do is just a little bit of dirt at a time. That also makes me think of the incremental change. Like there is movement. The tunnel is getting finished. It just takes a long, long time, because we can only do a little at a time. Beautiful.
Adriana, do you have a question for us? I can't believe I'm asking people.
I mean, and also,
And not to put you on the spot, does anybody out there have any questions? This is your time to ask personal questions. You may never have this chance.
moment.
I feel called out.
I called you out. I'm sorry. You can call me names.
It's okay. You must have felt that I was thinking, but I think I'm also just so awestruck. I mean, it really is such a privilege to be in this space with the three of you at one time. And so much of what you said has really, that each of you has said has really resonated with me, and you know, what I'm working on, but also reading your work and what it means to me to keep going back to that work to inspire me. I was thinking about the poem as a place, some of the questions about the poem or poetry being a place to deal with loss and trauma. And I think that for me, something that I've been really thinking about is how the poems, and now I've been writing some poems in letters too, are brief because that's all I can handle in that moment. And I'm kind of always rushing to get out because it's so hard to kind of come to certain spaces and places within the poems. So I was wondering if any of you or all of you could even talk a little bit about that, about what you do when you're coming up against the things that you would rather turn away from within the poem. Do you just force yourself to stick with it? Do you allow yourself to close the poem and then start something new? I would love to hear a little bit about that.
I think I'll just say that I think it's a great question. Thank you, by the way. I think I usually do well working in short bursts, and I think which goes to the idea of like how much emotional energy do I have to concentrate, and so I do like to work for, and this is meaning like when I'm actually writing. When I'm revising, I can do that for indefinitely, but when I'm actually writing, I do think that I have to keep it a little bit brief. I remember Nick Flynn, I saw him read from his memoir, and he said that he would write, he rented a room or something, and he had a mattress on the floor, and he would write, and then he'd get overwhelmed, and then he'd take a nap, and then he would get up from a nap, and he would write again until he was overwhelmed, and he would go take a nap again. And I was like, that sounds not like what I'm doing, but like my ideal. So, and that's how he got through that book. And that was useful for me to know.
It's such a great question, Adriana, and I'm so sorry that I called you out, but I was thinking, you know, one of the things I realized recently, I'm just not quite sure how to say this, is the process of poetry for me, because it's occluded, because it's not direct, you know, it's like under a gauze. That's how I'm able to write about the things I'm able to write about. And the reason it's come up is because now I'm writing philosophical texts. I can't write like that, right? It's like get to the point and say the thing. And it's been very hard because again, you know, with poetry, I can say things by showing you something, you know, or using a text. I can do these. So I've become very good at this kind of gestural kind of thing. So to answer the question, I mean, that allows me to write about things because they still remain underneath, if that makes sense. But I think also what you were saying, Allison, you know, and not writing for long increments of time. I think when I have had a lot of time to write poems, then I would do like several one time. So there's a way that I'm like fully engaged, but also kind of not, if that makes sense. And it's like art, like when I'm doing collages or something like that. And then, but what happens is as I revise the poem and I compulsively revise the poem, that also, then I'm also getting closer to the thing. It's like you were saying, the spoon, like this slowly getting there. But because I have the protection of language, really, there's this distance, and so I don't actually have to sort of touch the thing. I could kind of go around it. And then also, by revising, I can get closer, but I revise and then I step aside. So I think that's how I'm able to do it. I don't know if that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you. And call me out anytime.
That's so interesting, Cynthia, the gauze. I think my process is similar to that in some ways. I think like if I ever become self-aware of what I'm doing when I'm writing, then I can't do the writing. And I think that's part of what moved me to study German or something, like always I felt like trapped or something in some way. There was something that felt trapped, and like I'm always wanting to find a different music, um, in my head, um, which is where I think my poems come from. Like I'm in this conflict lately where I can't decide if it's imagery or music. That's the source. And what I mean by that is I'm thinking about prosody, and I'm thinking about the syllable and like the sound of poetry, and like I'm in a quagmire there currently because I used to think it was the image. But then I realized like it wouldn't, you wouldn't have image without the music. And so but I think that's what's really helpful about studying other languages, and reading outside of one's primary genre is really important. If I didn't read fiction, I would have a harder time ordering my manuscripts. That helps with arc, and there are characters in poetry. There's character development, of course. If I didn't translate, I wouldn't have this well of new sounds and images and music and a whole cultural context and historical context to be writing in conversation with. I just wanted to add that.
Should we call it there? Thank you all so much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the incredible readings. Thanks for the book, Cynthia. Thanks for both the books, Cynthia.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Allison and
All.
Carlie.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Congrats, Cindy.
And one day we'll celebrate in person.
Yes, yes, please.
You
Have a good Saturday. Happy New Year.
too, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Bye.